Hey, last Sunday we started a message series in the book of Romans, called it Wisdom from Romans. And I wanted to expand on that today a little bit as we focus on some timeless truths from Romans. Now, certainly in this series, we're not going to include every key passage in Romans, so don't send me emails saying you missed something good. But we're trying to highlight some of the key ideas and unpack the book of Romans because it's just so full of the truth of God. The book of Romans is a little bit different from all of the other letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to the churches in the New Testament. Typically, he would write a letter to a church that he had helped to establish or a city where he had visited, oftentimes even lived there for a time. So in most of those letters he wrote to churches, he is reminding the Christians there of what he already taught, highlighting things that he had already laid out for them. So the message in his other letters to the churches is not as comprehensive as we find in Romans, because he hadn't been there. Romans is the most doctrinally complete letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, rich in doctrine, a lot about the truth of the gospel. Paul wanted to visit there. He couldn't initially. Eventually he would be arrested and go there for trial. But he wanted to take some extra time to speak what he would normally teach in person. So we have the book of Romans. If you study church history, you'll see that most revivals that took place had two things in common. One was a lot of prayer, and the second was study of the book of Romans. It's true of the Reformation movement. Martin Luther was studying in the book of Romans. It's true of the Wesleyan revival, which swept across Great Britain. It was started by Christians who were studying in the book of Romans. And so there's a lot of power. There's a lot of history in this book. And in chapter 1 of Romans, Paul is introducing himself to these folks that he never met. He doesn't know them except by reputation, and so he wants them to know some important things about him first. Some of the key verses we want to look at here in chapter 1 as we look at timeless truths are verses 16 and 17. Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Paul says this. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Why? "Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." And he's just talking about chronological order there. "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed." The righteousness of God is made known. A righteousness that is by faith, from first to last, just as it is written, "The righteous will live by faith." Righteousness. It's not by religious rules. It's not by religious traditions. It's not by the law. It's by faith, from first to last. Some translations say faith to faith. At the end of verse 17, the Apostle Paul quotes the prophet Habakkuk, where he says, "The righteous will live by faith." That's where our righteousness is found. It's not in our good deeds. It's not in what we didn't do. Our righteousness is found through faith in Jesus, the Christ. I think it's pretty great here that Paul starts out in verse 16 by beginning with the phrase, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." We all know the word gospel literally is translated good news, but initially it was a political term. It would typically be used to introduce a new emperor, someone who's coming on the scene, has a new way of doing things, and that would be the good news. The new emperor is going to fix everything, and that was the good news. All of your problems are going to be fixed because of this new ruler and this new king. The gospel to us is God's good news. It's of salvation through Jesus, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. It says so in 1 Corinthians 15. And the gospel is more than what is found in the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Paul says in verse 2 here that the gospel God promised beforehand was through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Even in the Old Testament, it's part of the gospel story, as the prophets were telling of a deliverer, a rescuer, talking about a Messiah who would come and save the people from their sins. I love this simple definition of the gospel. It is the salvation unleashing story of Jesus. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed of that. Think about the last time you were ashamed. Now, oftentimes we hear the word ashamed and we associate it with guilt. We're so embarrassed by something that we're actually guilty. But think about the last time that you were embarrassed. Researchers say that one thing that our embarrassing moments have in common is unwanted attention. In other words, if something happens to us in front of people, that's embarrassing. But if it happens and nobody saw it, that's not so bad, right? I came out of my driveway one time on an icy winter morning, new shirt, new slacks, even new shoes, leather-bottomed new shoes. I should have known it wasn't going to end well. One minute I'm walking, the next minute I'm looking at the tops of my shoes about this high. I fell to the ground. I'm soaking wet, laying there in this wet, icy driveway. At this point, I am not sure I can even get back up. And you know what's the first thing I did? I looked around to see if anybody saw me fall. And no one saw me fall. And I'm like thinking, praise God, nobody saw me fall. Now I'm slightly paralyzed, but I don't care because no one was out there to see me. It's a bigger deal when you get unwanted attention. Lots of examples of this. I won't ask you to raise your hands. Spilling your drink, ripping your pants, shooting an air ball in a game. Credit card gets declined. You push the door that says pull. Anybody ever do that? I said I won't ask you to raise your hands. I can tell by the laughter, every one of us have done that. And then your face is like pretty smashed into the glass door. We all have those kind of embarrassing moments. Like maybe when it's the quiet time in the sermon and the preacher's really ready to make a point and your stomach growls so loud that everybody can hear it. Or maybe it's when you thought you were replying to just one and you hit reply all. We have embarrassing moments. I have a friend that came to church one time with 2 different shoes on. Our previous preacher, George Hall, preached a whole sermon with his fly open and his shirt partially sticking out of his fly. That's it. I love this thing. At prayer meeting one time, someone fell asleep and actually fell out of their chair. Here's mine. And for the weak of stomach and the weak of heart, I may have to ask you to leave here. But if you think you can get through this, here's mine. One time where I worked, my boss asked me to pick up his car at the service station. He was having the oil changed or something like that. It was a brand new car. As I'm pulling into the parking space, I sneezed. And perhaps I didn't get my mouth completely covered. That was way before the sneezing in the arm stuff. That's when you covered your mouth with your hand. And I didn't do so well. An hour or so later, he got in his car to drive home for the day. And he called me and said, and I came up and he said, "What is that?" And he points to the rearview mirror of the car, and there is this gelatinous mass hanging from it. I said, "Boss, you got to let me explain." He said, "I don't want you to explain. Just clean it up and clean it up with something with alcohol in it." I looked all over that car for that mass. I couldn't find it. We all have embarrassing moments. Many we just hope nobody notices. Had he driven home and found it at home, maybe he thought he did it. But he noticed. And I think the Apostle Paul understands that there is an aspect to the gospel that maybe is embarrassing to the Roman Christians because it's so countercultural to them. Maybe it even makes them a little bit ashamed. It's so countercultural that it went against what everyone in Rome thought or believed. So much so that it might be tempting to just, hide. Keep it to yourself. Maybe even be a little ashamed. These Christians in Rome were on the receiving end of unwanted attention, and it would have been a natural tendency to want to disappear, to go unnoticed, maybe even deeper than that, to be embarrassed and ashamed to the point of guilt. Rome at this time was the greatest empire in the world. It was one of the most powerful cities of the world. It was the largest city in the world, with a population of about 1 million people. Nero was the Caesar, the emperor, and Nero was a perverted, vile man. And that may be a huge understatement. Nero was a brutal, perverted, vile man. And he hated Christians. Eventually, the persecution of the Christians under Nero's reign would become so severe. At one point, he burnt the city and blamed it on the Christians to make the persecution even more severe. At the time Paul wrote the book of Romans, Christianity was in its fledgling stages. Christians were marginalized, they were ridiculed, but the real severe persecution hadn't begun yet. A couple of reasons why Nero and the other people living in Rome would have not liked Christians. We have a slide for that. You see, Rome was first a polytheistic culture, meaning there that the people worshipped many gods. The city was greatly influenced by Greek mythology, and there were all kinds of places to worship, representing many gods, and some of them weren't real great gods. And here's something you need to understand. A cultural core value in Rome was tolerance. Sound familiar to today? Tolerance was a big deal. So Rome would conquer a new nation or a new land, and the people would be allowed to worship the same god or gods that they worshiped before they were conquered. The only thing was that they were required to add one god to the list of who they worshiped, the emperor. And for most people, that wasn't a problem. They already worshiped this crazy list of gods. Sure, we'll add the emperor to it. But here are these Christians. And the Christian faith is absolutely monotheistic. At the core of this faith, there is a God. And suddenly you find that this really tolerant city, that there's one thing that they won't tolerate. And so these Christians were feeling that pressure. Second point of the city of Rome is that it was a very hedonistic culture. It would be hard to overstate the level of sexual immorality in the city of Rome. We're sometimes aware of the moral decline in our culture. We say, oh man, it's bad out there. But let's be clear here. We don't even come in a close second to the kind of stuff that was happening at the time in Rome. The level of depravity was tremendous. So much so, I could give you examples, but I can't say them here today. What was completely okay then is completely illegal now. And of course, with a hedonistic worldview, you only had value if somebody could bring you pleasure. You only valued the people who make you happy, who give you pleasure, who make your life easy. As a result, in Rome, the elderly were marginalized at best. The sick and disabled were not taken care of in Rome. Babies were often abandoned. Fanticide was a significant issue. Yeah, we're going to have all this crazy sex stuff going on. And if I have a baby, well, we'll just let it die. And in come these Christians who are believing and preaching a gospel that is completely countercultural. And in this polytheistic, this hedonistic culture, these Christians are starting to get labeled as, they're a bunch of intolerant prudes. Sound familiar? Now understand that these were first generation Christians. The faith they had, the commitment to follow Jesus, wasn't passed down on them from generation to generation. They were the start. And so you can maybe understand why they might be tempted to be a little embarrassed, even ashamed. It's just so different from what everyone else is saying, from what everyone else believes. And some of us understand that because it's somewhat the world we're living in today. Maybe at work, in the classroom. Maybe it's your own family where you're ridiculed and made fun of. Maybe even because you're here today. Nobody believes what you believe. And so Paul, as much as anyone, when he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he understands the opposition the gospel can bring about. For preaching the gospel, he was thrown into prison in Philippi. He was chased out of town in Thessalonica. He was laughed at and ridiculed in Athens. 5 different times he was beaten. Twice he was stoned with rocks. And yet Paul is the guy saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Please let me draw attention to some of the statements that Paul makes in chapter 1 of Romans as he introduces himself to these Christians in Rome. Because I think it can help us understand how he and how we can have this bold faith as we talk about the gospel and how we can display the gospel in our lives. In verse 1, Paul introduces himself. Romans 1:1. He says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Third word there is the word servant. Paul doesn't know these people. They don't know him. And he's introducing himself. And right out of the gate, he says, Paul, a servant. But servant isn't quite enough. The word translated in the Greek here for servant is the word doulos. And that word in Greek doesn't mean servant. The NIV translated it as servant, but it's not what the word means. There are 6 different other words Paul could have used that could have been translated servant. Doulos is not one of them. The word is not servant, the word is slave. That's the word, slave. Paul, you don't even know these people. Is this how you really want to introduce yourself? Really, Paul? The first thing you want to say about yourself is you're a slave? It's kind of an embarrassing word. It's a word you wouldn't be proud to use for yourself. But the people he wrote to understood the word slave. And they knew the difference between a servant and a slave. In the city of Rome of about 1 million people, roughly a third of them would have been slaves. Anybody do the math? About 300,000 of them living in that city were slaves. The majority of the people in the Roman church likely were slaves. So Paul says, I'm a slave. And they knew the difference. See, a servant works for somebody, a slave is owned by somebody. Later in Romans chapter 6, Paul talks about this image of a slave, where he helps us to understand the fact that we are all slaves to something. We're either slaves to sin, which leads to death, or we are slaves to Jesus, which leads to freedom and life. Because in Jesus we are adopted sons and daughters. Right out of the gate, though, Paul says, I'm a slave. And so for those reading this letter, they understood that a slave meant the only thing that mattered about you is who is your master. Didn't matter any of your accomplishments, any education. The only thing that mattered about a slave was who is your master. And the Apostle Paul tells the Roman church, I am a slave to Jesus the Christ. That's the level of his surrender. Jesus is his master. Jesus is his Lord. Funny thing about slaves don't negotiate. Slaves didn't say, I don't do Sundays. I don't do mornings. I don't do windows either. That's not how the relationship works. And that's how Paul sees his relationship with Jesus. He's a slave and Jesus is the master. He has surrendered on that level. He has signed things over. He has given up his rights. Paul says later in some of his other letters to the churches, he had died to himself. For Paul, these words help us understand why he could preach. Why he could preach the gospel and not be ashamed. People aren't rejecting me, they're rejecting the master. People aren't rejecting my message, they're rejecting the message my master asked me to deliver. The delivery guy can deliver a package to your house, and you can get mad at the delivery guy, but he's just delivering the package. And I think this gave Paul a lot of freedom. He didn't take it personally. He understood that he was just being obedient to his master. Look at Romans 1, verse 14. See, here Paul makes another I am statement, also in his introduction. He says, I am obligated to both Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the foolish. Pretty much covers it all, right? I'm in the first group of non-Greeks, probably in the group of foolish too. So, yeah, he's covering all bases. And the word obligated has the literal meaning of in debt to. I'm in debt to both Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the foolish, to all. We talked a little bit about that last week. That's why I started this message series there. We tend to think of debt as a burden, kind of where you borrow money from a bank and you have to pay it back over the next 30 years. And you never really truly delight in that. You rejoice, in fact, when the debt is paid off. It's an unwanted burden. But when Paul talks about being in debt, it's a different idea. It's like someone has given you something great, and you need to give it to someone else. And you're in debt to that person until you give it to the other person, what you've been entrusted. I told you once before, one time someone left an envelope with $400 in it and told me to give it to someone who at the time was having some financial struggles. I held on to the money till I saw them, and then I gave it to the person who was struggling. Now, that's not a burden to me. I'm giving good news. It's not my $400. It's not my generosity. I just get to deliver it. But until I deliver it, I'm in debt to that person. It's not a burden, though. It's a privilege. I I have good news that I get to share. And so Paul says it's not a burden to share the gospel. It's just delivering the good news that brings salvation. I'm in debt to both Greeks and non-Greeks to deliver this message. I'm in debt to the wise and to the foolish to deliver this message. Verse 15 is another introduction statement. He says, "That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome." You're part of the non-Greeks. He didn't go into wise or foolish at this point. You're part of the non-Greeks. I'm in debt to share the good news. I'm not avoiding Rome. I'm not trying to steer clear of it because it's this crazy immoral city. I'm going to get there, and we know eventually he does. Then in verses 16 and 17, we see the verses we started out with today. And please notice, it's another I am statement. And it's another timeless truth. I am not ashamed of the gospel. Why is he not ashamed of the gospel? Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentiles. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. See, the gospel doesn't tell us about the power of God. The gospel doesn't show us the power of God. The gospel is the power of God. There is power in the gospel to everyone who believes. And Paul is certainly not ashamed of that. I think what happens sometimes in the church is that the gospel is so countercultural that it gets watered down. The church tries to make it a little more palatable to the culture, and they settle for a lesser version. We settle for some feel-good, emotional, or shallow self-help stuff. Tom, that's what those books you were talking about are all about. When it's all here. When the church becomes ashamed of the gospel, it's usually because they're more concerned about being relevant than about revealing the righteousness of God. So here's what we need to remember as the church, and I think it's important. What makes the gospel relevant is not that it is like our culture. What makes the gospel relevant is that it is not like our culture. What makes the gospel relevant is not that it lines up with popular opinion or what some celebrity thinks. The gospel stands on itself, and it's relevant because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. So as the church, we don't try to stay relevant by massaging the gospel so that it lines up with the latest polls or so that it agrees with popular opinion. In fact, there's so many churches out there that have become completely irrelevant because that's what they have tried to do. And in trying to be like everyone else, they have nothing to offer that leads people to the righteousness of God. Nothing real. No real power to save. People come to church broken, and all they hear is, well, the exact same message that they hear in society at large. They could have stayed home and heard the same thing from Dr. Phil or Oprah or Ellen. And none of that brings the righteousness of God. As the church, we're not ashamed of the fact that we have the gospel. And that it's different from what the rest of the world is trying to sell. And it has power. We've been trusted with the good news of the gospel of Jesus the Christ, the free gift of grace through faith in him. As I wind down, let me tell you, D.A. Carson is a Christian writer. He wrote a book, I don't remember the title offhand. He talks about the watering down of the gospel, and he refers to it as domesticating the gospel. And we domesticate the gospel when we talk about God, but we won't talk about Jesus. Reggie White, the ex-football player, used to say when he wanted people away from his locker, he would start talking about Jesus. He said the reporters would stay if I talked about God. As soon as I said Jesus, they were gone. And we domesticate the gospel when we preach about salvation, but we won't talk about sin. And we domesticate the gospel when we avoid talking about the Holy Spirit because that can weird some people out. And we domesticate the gospel when we turn repentance and surrender into a message of self-help. And we domesticate the gospel when we're more concerned with offending someone than saving someone. And we domesticate the gospel when we leave out the uncomfortable parts, because some of those parts aren't so appealing. Folks, the gospel is for everyone. It is completely inclusive. The offer is for everyone. The power comes to those who believe. Salvation comes to those who believe. We are so privileged. God has been so good to us. He has offered us salvation from our sin. And not just eternal salvation, but to save us from our sinning right now. I can't think of a better way to end this message than with a timeless truth from Romans 1. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, to all. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith.